When VALIE EXPORT walked through Vienna in 1968, with Peter Weibel crawling behind her, the city didn't flinch. The trams rattled past, coats brushed against coats, and shoes kept striking the pavement in their usual rhythm. The shock came from something else entirely, a break in the pattern. A woman, elegantly dressed, walking ahead, a man on all fours, a leash between them. This was a scene with no business appearing on an ordinary February afternoon. And because it happened right there, in the middle of everything, you might expect people to stop, to stare. But most didn't. Vienna kept walking, and that quiet continuation became its own kind of revelation. Hi, I'm Philippe, and this is Photography and Walking. So, what remains of this action today is photographic. VALIE Exports from the portfolio of Doggedness is made of 5 black and white documentary photographs, each about 40 by 50 centimeters, framed between glass plates, simple, direct records of Export walking and Weibel crawling behind her. There is no video, no reconstruction. The work endures precisely through these street photographs, which frees the brief disturbance of Vienna's everyday rhythm. VALIE Export doesn't comment on any of that directly. She simply steps into the logic of the street and interrupts it. And she reveals how quickly the everyday can crack open when a gesture refuses to stay in its lane. Vienna, in the 1960s, was a city primed for this kind of cracking. The actionists had already been challenging the boundaries of public life, staging raw, confrontational performances in streets and squares. VALIE Export is often placed near them historically, though her approach is different. Their work leaned toward extremes, hers towards precision. They centered male bodies, she centered the woman as agent. And she does this in a way that feels almost quiet compared to their brutality, but just as radical. What I find striking is how she doesn't build a scene. She arrives in one. She uses the city the way a photographer uses light, as something already active, already shaping behavior. The sidewalk, the crowd, even the cars, the choreography of everyday life, she lets that be the stage. And then there's the leash. It's the element you can't ignore, a line from one body to another. But the more time you spend with the photographs, the more symbolic that line becomes. The leash guides movement. It organizes direction and pace. Cities do this too, but with street plans, crossings, storefronts, and the subtle etiquette of public space. Years earlier, theorists of urban life had already argued that cities are never neutral. They carry the values and hierarchies that shape them. VALIE Export's walk makes that argument physical. You can feel it in the tension between the two bodies. You can feel it in the glance of a passerby. These pictures show how the city choreographs us long before we realize we've joined the dance. So, to understand from the portfolio of Doggedness, you have to feel the ground it stood on. These 5 street snapshots, VALIE Export walking calmly ahead while Peter Weibel crawls behind her on all fours, tethered by a leash, make no sense if lifted out of their moment. Seen today, stripped of context, the photos risk reading like an S&M stunt gone theatrical. But in 1968, the gesture lived inside the pressure chamber of second-wave feminism, a movement grinding against centuries of patriarchal obedience and opening new cracks in public space. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex was still echoing across Europe, and Kate Millet's Sexual Politics was about to detonate in print. It was a period in which women were naming structures that had always been there and demanding to walk differently through the world. Seen from today, though, the piece belongs unmistakably to second-wave feminism, a moment when critique worked by inversion and by flipping the hierarchy so its structure became visible. Fourth-wave feminism reads it differently, not as a universal statement, but as a historically situated gesture shaped by whiteness, gender binaries, and the limited frameworks of its time. Yet the force remains. VALIE EXPORT made the street show its gender, and that revelation continues to resonate, even as feminist thinking has expanded far beyond inversion alone. Layer onto that the wider turbulence of 1968, the Vietnam War intensifying, the Prague Spring crushed, May 68 in Paris refusing the old order, and then consider the location. Vienna, not New York, not Paris, but Vienna, rigid, devoutly conservative, suspicious of avant-garde provocation. To stage this inversion of power there, in the open street, was not a curiosity, it was a direct confrontation. The photographs hold that tension, and even the casual clothes and ordinary pavement point to tectonic forces shifting underneath. Vienna is not a neutral backdrop in this story. VALIE EXPORT's walk derives its charge precisely because of the city's character. Post-war Vienna cultivated orderliness, politeness, restraint, visible codes of behavior that structured everyday life. Against that backdrop, any deviation from the expected choreography wasn't just unusual. It was almost a moral offense. And public space in such a city is deeply gendered. Streets and squares may appear neutral, but the norms governing who walks where, how, and with what confidence were, and often still are, coded masculine. Women in public were expected to be legible, modest, purposeful, unthreatening. VALIE EXPORT understood this intuitively. She steps into that gendered architecture and breaks its internal rhythm. Not with spectacle, but with posture, with direction, with an insistence that the woman is not simply passing through public space, but shaping it. So Vienna, by resisting change, inadvertently sharpens VALIE EXPORT's gesture. The conservative city becomes the perfect surface on which her disruption registers, not because the city reacts loudly, but because it barely reacts at all. And that indifference is the atmosphere she cuts through. Meanwhile, much of the 1960s avant-garde was obsessed with escaping the studio. The walls felt too narrow, too insulated, too safe and controlled. Artists wanted to test their ideas against the world itself, not against the clean neutrality of a room. Walking as an artistic practice is born directly out of this impulse, a movement I'll return to in a later episode, when the canonical experiments of the late 1960s come into focus. But for now, what matters is the energy of that shift. The studio was no longer enough. The street became the site where thought met risk. But for VALIE EXPORT, the move into the street wasn't about expanding art's territory. It was about stepping into a place that wasn't built for her. The studio is a space of safety, controlled, private, shielded from judgment. The street is the opposite, a contested terrain where bodies are scrutinized, measured, policed. Her gesture becomes a kind of counter-photography. She exposes what is usually unphotographed, the asymmetry of danger, the unequal stakes of simply walking outside, the constant negotiation women make between presence and safety. VALIE EXPORT uses the street not just as a surface, but as a force field. In the photographs of VALIE EXPORT's action, all of these layers come into focus. Export stands upright, composed. Weibel's body is low, almost folded into the ground. Their pace feels disciplined, calm. And around them, the street does what streets usually do. It continues. A few glances, perhaps, but mostly people stay in motion, practicing the quiet indifference that governs urban life. The real fracture isn't in the spectators' reactions. It's in how little reaction there is. But a rupture that barely registers is sometimes the most revealing kind. Writers in contemporary performance studies often talk about how actions in public space reveal the seams of social life. VALIE EXPORT doesn't tug at those seams. She lifts them slowly. She offers a disturbance that lets the street figure itself out around her. No manifesto, no speech. Just two bodies linked moving through a city that isn't quite sure what to do with them, and mostly chooses to do nothing. And this is precisely where her work intersects with photography and walking. A photograph freezes the moment when the world stops behaving the way we expect it to. A walk reveals the shapes and rules of the place that surround us. VALIE EXPORT's action does both. It disturbs the walk and disturbs the look, even when the street barely registers it. It offers a tiny break in the smooth functioning of a city, and in that break, everything becomes visible: power, gender, movement, structure. What stays with me is how little she needs in order to make all of this surface. No slogans, no large gestures. The leash is a metaphor, yes, but VALIE EXPORT didn't shout. She didn't demand. She simply walked. Thank you for listening. You can find more at photographyandwalking.com, including all episodes, pictures, and links to Instagram and YouTube.